everyone, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Amy, and I'm on the marketing team here at Gravity Union. And we are here for From Resistance to Readiness, transforming records management with change management. Now, before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. So, of course, the recording on these slides will be shared via email after the session. We highly encourage you to be involved in the session, so please use the Q&A for questions and comments as we go. Maybe take a moment to find that Q&A chat box right now. And of course, captions are available under the ellipses menu. With that, I will kick it off to our host. Anthony, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Amy. All right, hello everyone. My name is Anthony Salopek, and I'm a digital transformation analyst at Gravity Union. I specialize in M365, so everything SharePoint, Purview, and Power Platform. And I've worked with digital transformation projects for clients across many diverse industries. I have a degree in data analytics from the University of Alberta, and then I also have multiple certifications from Microsoft, so administrator, information protection and compliance, and also Teams administrator associate. So that's just a little bit about me and my background. A quick citation or shout out I'd like to give at the start of this presentation is the art and artist you'll see. The artist is Takashi Mifune. He has a website called Irasutoya. It's a Japanese resource for free illustrations. You might have seen them in circulation just because he has a very, very large volume of images he's created. They're all appropriately cited, and I do recommend it as a resource if you're looking for free art to utilize in presentations with a consistent theme and style, especially if you would prefer to use real art instead of AI-generated art. And then a quick glossary as well. So here are just 3 acronyms you may hear me mention in today's presentation. The first one is RM. So if I say RM, I'm referring to records management. If I say IA, and that's IA, not AI, but if I say IA, I'm referring to information architecture or taxonomy. And finally, if you hear me say IG, I'm referring to information governance. So I just wanted to share those kind of quick acronyms just in case I say something and then you may be unfamiliar with what I mean. So our agenda for today's webinar. First, we're going to get into the learning objectives and our introduction, and then we're going to discuss the need for change management and understanding change management. Then the bulk of today's session is going to be connecting to theory, so we're going to be pulling insights from 2 different books. We're going to get into a case study and some solutions, designing user-centric strategies, how will we go about communicating the value of records management, and then finally, actionable strategies for risk mitigation. Then by the end of today's presentation, here are our 3 learning outcomes. Number 1, you're going to be able to understand the role of change management in regard to records management. You're going to be able to understand how to set the foundation for seamless records management. And then number 3, you're going to be able to perform risk mitigation in relation to records management solutions. So just as we're going through today's slides, think of these learning outcomes and how we connect to them, and then we'll review back at the end. So, have you ever experienced resistance to change when deploying a records management solution? Chances are most of you already have. If we were together in the room, I'd probably see a whole bunch of hands rise up, but often you've probably felt like the person on the left where there's too many physical records, digital records are unclassified, there's duplication, it just makes you kind of want to throw up all the records and, just move on with it. But unfortunately, we do have to go through that process of classifying and disposition and everything. And so what we hope to do is to take you from the left-hand side to the right-hand side where everyone is happy and we have successfully rolled out a records management project. So our first definition is, what is change management? Most of you are probably familiar with change management, but just as a quick definition, change management is a structured approach to transitioning individuals, teams, and organizations from a current state to a desired future state. Okay, so within change management, there's a couple key concepts. So change management typically involves clear communication, leadership and engagement, the ability to change a culture. So every organization does have its culture. There will be consistent monitoring and feedback as part of rolling out change management, training and support throughout the process, and of course, communicating the strategic goals as to why the change is occurring. So that's just a definition on change management. Our next slide delves into a famous example. I'm sure everyone on this call has heard of Microsoft. So Microsoft's focus on cultural change, cloud computing, and open source collaboration had transformed it from a stagnant company into a $2 trillion tech leader by 2021. And then there's a book by Satya Nadella called Hit Refresh, and it kind of pulls these concepts of change management to, of course, increase the profitability of the organization. This is just one example, but there are numerous examples of organizations going through a change management process and then reaping multiple benefits from doing so. So with change management, we try to find the balance. So when deploying records management solutions, organizations need to find the balance between three parties. So first, we have the records managers, as we are focusing on records management in regard to change management. But records managers, they're going to be in pursuit of this ideal state or a capstone achievement of a records management deployment. So kind of the best of the best, what we can get from the end users and the software. But now we also have to have a balance with the software itself. So these are going to be the capabilities and limitations of our chosen records management software. And then finally, we have the end users. So we want to minimize end user involvement in this change management, and also their resistance to change. We're going to try to minimize that as well. So when minimizing end user involvement for records management, what that looks like is just not expecting users to intimately know the entire retention schedule and have to manually classify things. We're going to want to do that as automated as possible. However, there are some caveats to that. So the need for change management arises because it's going to be very important to have a successful deployment. You may already be thinking, well, if we use automated records management to minimize the risk of misclassification or minimize the involvement that end users have to have in this process, we're already okay. And if you did say that, I would probably start sweating. And the reason why is automated records management is definitely part of the solution, but it's not the only solution. And we will definitely still run into risks. So it is partially true. We don't expect end users to intimately know the correct records classifications and the full ins and outs of our retention policy and schedule. So automated records management can increase compliance and security, improve the accuracy and efficiency of classifying. It provides an audit trail and reduces errors when configured correctly. However, there are some really big limitations if there is absolutely no user involvement or cultural change that will allow for successful automated records management. And then this is where the need for change management comes in. The reason why is automated systems rely on accurate data, proper categorization, and adherence to policies by end users. So just to reiterate, to have a successful automated records management solution, we need to make sure that we have the accurate data input, the proper categorization of documents, and then making sure that users are adhering to the policies in place. Without the end user's cooperation, the system cannot function effectively, therefore leading to errors, inefficiencies, and incomplete records. So what I have here is just this little kind of supply chain diagram, but to really drive it home is that quality inputs will yield a quality output, whereas poor inputs are going to result in a poor output. So why are end users still involved in records management is to ensure metadata accuracy, ensuring that they're saving documents in approved locations, and avoiding duplication. Those are just some examples, but there's many, many other reasons why end users will still be involved in the RM process, just not necessarily focusing that they need to understand the retention schedule intimately and individually classify every document they ever engage with. But a lot of their other actions, we will need their involvement for a successful RM deployment. All right. So what can we do to mitigate these risks is that we want to identify them as early as possible. With any project or change that we roll out to the organization, we should just anticipate or assume that there will be risks. So instead of triaging them when they come up, we will identify them at the beginning. So identify common barriers like resistance to new processes and habitual work patterns. So think about what current work processes, integrations, and working styles could make an automated records management solution difficult to implement. So if we just think about SharePoint, if we have a SharePoint environment where we're not controlling who can create Teams channels and we have no communications around, sending links and not attachments, and users aren't saving things in the right location, it's going to make automated records management just so much more difficult versus if we had a fully cleanly structured information architecture that maps really nicely to our retention schedule. Another thing we're going to do at the beginning, besides identifying the barriers and risks, is discussing the pitfalls of implementing a records management solution without a human-focused changed approach. So who are the informed parties for event-based retention? These are typically the end users. So the end users would know best when an event has occurred. That will take time off you as a records manager or an IT personnel having to go through and find that applicable information to figure out what would be the appropriate event date or event trigger for a given file. So our key insight is that we need to position change as a critical enabler that will therefore transform resistance into proactive readiness and engagement. So what we're going to get into now is the need for change management. So change management isn't just about technology, it's about the people. So we're going to explore some frameworks that will turn resistance into readiness. So hopefully everyone here by the end of today's presentation can feel like they've powered up and they have new tools in their toolbox to kind of tackle and triage change. All right, so the first change management framework we're going to get into is ADKAR. Some of you may be familiar with ADKAR, some of you may not. It's a very traditional and kind of the first go-to when it comes to a framework for change management. So ADKAR provides a structured sequential framework that focuses on individual transitions during change. And if you're wondering what ADKAR stands for, it's just an acronym. So ADKAR, the A stands for awareness, and this is kind of the first stage in change management for ADKAR, is that there is an understanding for the need for change and people recognize why it's necessary to change. So there's kind of this awareness of this change that's oncoming. The second stage is desire, where users start to cultivate motivation to support and engage in this change process. So at first they're aware of it, but then they desire it. The next stage is knowledge. So after desiring the change, they want to learn how to change by acquiring the necessary skills and information. After knowledge, in stage 4, users go into ability. So now they are developing and implementing the required behaviors and competencies to sustain the change. And then finally, we have the reinforcement, which is the sustained change through rewards, recognition, and continuous feedback loops. So some of you may have tried implementing ADKAR before or researched this framework, but what I wanted to call out is potentially some gaps in the ADKAR model, and then how we're going to be able to answer those with the frameworks in the oncoming slides. So the first gap with ADKAR is limited intrinsic motivation. ADKAR addresses desire, but may not fully capture the deeper motivators of autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And as you can kind of see in the model, it goes from awareness just to desire. So there is this kind of assumption that as going through this change management framework or this process, awareness will lead to desire for the change, but not necessarily. Just because you're aware of something doesn't mean you're actually going to want it unless there is a deeper motivator. The next one is this balance between emotional and rational. So ADKAR focuses on a more linear process without addressing the interplay between rational thinking and emotional thinking. So there's a chance that maybe like someone is knowledgeable and they have the ability to work within the new solution or the new system, but just due to maybe, being on a previous project that didn't go successfully or their own kind of fears and inhibitions, they may not actually desire the change. So ADKAR is kind of a more linear process, but potentially users might actually be in multiple stages of ADKAR simultaneously. And then the final gap in ADKAR is environmental and contextual factors. So the model doesn't emphasize the importance of shaping the environment to facilitate change. And obviously, the environment that we live and work in will have a big impact on our receptiveness to change. So with that, we're going to get into our first change management framework. So this is based on the book called Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard by Chip and Dan Heath. So it's a full book. I recommend everyone to go ahead and read this one and then the next one that we'll discuss. But just to distill this into 3 core concepts, we're going to discuss the core concepts from the Switch framework about what is the core of change. So these 3 core concepts from Switch are the rider, the elephant, and the path. So the rider represents the rational and analytical side of decision making, and it requires clear and logical guidance to navigate the change. So that's element number 1, the rider. So at the core of change, the rider is just that logical component. Element number 2 is the elephant, and this embodies the emotional and intuitive aspects of behavior and motivates and drives change through feelings and personal values. So if the rider represents logic, the elephant represents the emotional aspects of a change. And finally, we have the path. So the path is the environment or context that shapes and facilitates behavior. So the path emphasizes the importance of creating the conditions that make change easier to adopt. So just as a simple example, if we have the rider as logic, the elephant as emotion, and the path as the environment, let's pretend the change is you want to learn how to drive, you currently don't drive. So obviously the logic is that if you drive, you'll be able to get to your work quicker, maybe you can visit family that live a little farther away. There's a clear logical benefit to being able to drive, being able to go to the grocery store and put everything in your car. Now there's the emotional aspect. How do we feel about driving? We understand that driving can benefit us in some ways, but what is our emotional attachment to this outcome? Do we have fears about driving? Have we ever been in a car accident before or with someone else where they were driving and they were in a car accident, or have we witnessed one that might introduce fear? Do we have like sustained behaviors or beliefs around why driving would kind of support us in the long run? And then we have the path. So, do we have friends and family who can coach and mentor us, who know how to drive? Or maybe we're the first person who wants to learn how to drive in our friend circle. And, this environment can really impact us. What are the cost of driving lessons? What is our city design like? Do we have public transit or alternative to driving? There's so many factors that come into play, but I like to use the example of driving just because it really illustrates how these 3 kind of elements come into play. So by leveraging change management principles from Switch specific to records management, we're now going to connect these principles to change management in the world of records management now. So number 1 is going to be directing the rider, and this is going to be all about clarity and logic. So we are providing clear, logical frameworks that would guide users through the records management process, the change we're trying to make, really a very clear and tangible communication about what this project is for, what this solution is for. So just that clarity and logic that we're going to drive home. Then, using the second element, we're going to motivate the elephant, which is empathy and engagement. So it's not enough to say, okay, here is the tangible benefit of rolling out a records management solution or adopting Purview or adopting this other system from RM. We now need to focus on the emotional side. So we need to be able to address user fears by sharing success stories and demonstrating the tangible benefits of records management, and consistently use empathetic communications. And then number 3, shaping the path. This is going to be simplifying systems. So we are going to integrate records management with the needs of the end user's information architecture and automate as much as possible to therefore make this change have its best chance in an environment where users feel empowered in the system, like their voice matters, and that overlaying an automated records management solution for classifying and disposition will layer on very seamlessly versus having to restructure and change everything the way that files are structured to make it work. So that's our first framework, and that is switch. Our second framework is more about motivation. So this book is Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us by Daniel H. Pink. And once again, we have distilled this book into kind of these three core takeaways about what motivates us. But what it really boils down to is these three elements: is autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So if the first framework, switch, focuses more so on how do we kind of get that change rolling out, how do we support the change management process? Drive is more so about those intrinsic motivators that will help push the change over the finish line. So the first component is autonomy. This is people's desire for freedom and control over their work, being able to take ownership of their tasks. So most people in their day-to-day roles, they want a certain level of autonomy, and that will be a motivational factor. The second component to motivation is mastery, and this is the drive to continuously improve and become proficient in skills. Mastery isn't necessarily becoming like, the expert, but it's just continuously growing your skill set, learning new things, even if it's at little chunks at a time. This encourages a growth mindset and persistent learning. So if someone is kind of in a monotonous role, mastery is trying to learn new skills, improve, and become proficient in those skills. And finally, there is purpose. So this is the need to connect one's work to a larger, more meaningful goal, and helps individuals see the significance of their contributions. So now connecting the power of motivation and the concepts of drive to records management, here are the connections. So with autonomy, this is where we're going to be customizing an information architecture aligned with records management. And this could also look like user involvement in the disposition reviews as well. But the really, really crucial component is that when we are designing a SharePoint environment for a given department, we want to make sure we are utilizing their language and their taxonomy that makes sense. And then where necessary, we can make interjections to help support RM, saying maybe you need an expiry date column or a status to help indicate certain things. But for the most part, when they go into that SharePoint environment, it's something that they were involved in the design. It's not just that they wake up one day and the SharePoint was designed for them without any user feedback, because without that autonomous control, users begin to disengage because they feel like they have no impact on the solution, and therefore they don't really feel invested in the success of it. So that's autonomy. The second one is going to be mastery. So of course, with any change, we're going to need to provide continuous training and learning opportunities. So this is going to be like training sessions, maybe Scrum meetings, maybe some weekly communications sent out in Teams channels or emails. But what we want to do is foster a culture of expertise in digital records management. So providing as much resources as we can to make sure people feel informed, to make sure that they feel supported, and that they understand the changes that are happening and how they can become experts or proficient in the new system or solution. And finally is purpose. So this is just linking everyday individual contributions to organizational goals of compliance, efficiency, and better decision making. So let's just say we're communicating to people that they should be sharing links instead of attachments. We would want to communicate how sharing links benefits the org overall versus maybe they're sharing attachments and we have like a singular document that now has 10 duplicates in circulation. It makes it harder not only for records managers, but also for themselves and team members when they're trying to find that source of truth. All right. So integrating motivation and change management. So by integrating intrinsic motivators with a structured change management framework will help create a holistic approach that will reduce resistance and drive adoption. So what we want to do is empower and guide the end users, foster an environment of continuous improvement, and connect purpose with emotion. So now that we've discussed our two frameworks of drive and switch, now what we're going to get into is a little case study. So the goal was working with the municipality to migrate content across multiple departments from a legacy file share to SharePoint Online, and then layer on seamless records management. So the path is, once implemented in SharePoint, we'll be able to layer on records management, apply relevant metadata to support robust records management, such as event triggers. So once they've adopted SharePoint, they'll be able to just layer on Purview or their chosen RM system, have files classified, and then go through that kind of automated records management solution. However, the risk was significant user resistance. So we faced significant resistance and training hurdles due to reluctance to adopt the new system. And the key risk here is that without the user buy-in, this would result in a huge risk to the success of the project. And without a successful adoption of SharePoint, records management would just not be successful in classifying content. So if users are not saving their content into SharePoint, if they're not following best practices, if the information architecture or sites don't clearly, delineate where different file classifications should be living, we're not going to get a successful RM deployment. So this was kind of the key risk from this work. So what we had done is, by utilizing the change management frameworks, we were able to then overcome those risks. So leveraging Drive to motivate the users, and then utilizing Switch to address that resistance. All right, so our strategic response. By leveraging Drive to motivate users, number one, with autonomy, we want to empower the users by allowing them to customize their SharePoint sites and tailor the information architecture to their individual departmental needs. Sometimes on these projects, there's this idea that SharePoint sites can be templatized and that every department can roughly have the same template they work out of. More often than not, this is not correct. Different departments have different needs, different kind of wordings and taxonomies they may want to see. And if we don't adopt to their kind of working style, and if we don't integrate them as part of the SharePoint design, they're not going to feel invested. They're not going to feel like that they own the solution, and therefore they're not going to have the autonomy or the motivation to be invested in the successful outcome of the project. The next component from leveraging Drive to support motivation is mastery. So this would be providing targeted training sessions and hands-on workshops to build confidence and expertise in using SharePoint. This can also look like designating the power users as change management champions to support their colleagues. So with mastery, this isn't just, one big SharePoint training session for the whole organization. These are going to be very targeted training sessions for each department, supporting them, giving them that really, meaningful support throughout this process to promote the change, to make them feel like they're being supported in the process, that they're becoming experts in the system, that they know how to work effectively. And then some people who are really good at adopting the system or really excited about the change, we can help designate them as power users and use them to our leverage, because they'll be able to help support their colleagues. So that's autonomy and mastery. And then the last component is purpose. So this is connecting a SharePoint adoption to the municipality's broader mission of compliance and improved efficiency. Overall, this digital transformation is meant to reduce the workload of team members in the long run. So fundamentally, every time we go through a project or change management, we're doing this to not only benefit the organization, but also our team members and staff. So it's very important to communicate the purpose, that if we're adopting SharePoint, this isn't just a make work project, or this isn't just to the benefit of records management. The end users will see real tangible benefits from adopting the system for everyday things like sharing files, collaboration, process automation, and more. So that's kind of discussing through the motivational aspect. And now, how do we utilize Switch to then address the resistance? So number one, with the rider, or our logical component, this is delivering clear guidelines on the new information architecture, solution-specific training, and detailed steps to conducting a successful migration into SharePoint. So when we say clear guidelines on new information architecture, it's not like we're going to go into a session and say, hey, here's SharePoint, design it however you want. Of course, there's kind of this option paralysis where if users don't know a system or they don't know the best practices, it's going to be hard for them to make effective choices. So that's why we would guide them and kind of provide a framework to say, well, here's kind of the best practices of working in SharePoint and how we structure things like libraries and metadata and so on. So really their feedback just comes down to, you know, what libraries do I need? What metadata do I need? Versus being overwhelmed and having to build the site. We work collaboratively with the departments to support them in that process. So it's kind of like baking a cake. We have the chef. So the chef would be the SharePoint administrator, or in this instance, Gravity Union, who is creating the SharePoint site to the user's needs. And all the user has to communicate is communicate their wants and needs and what they desire to see out of the system. And then we use our expertise to attach that to what's feasible and what would work for them within SharePoint. So with baking a cake, the customer doesn't need to know how to bake the cake. They don't need to know the full back-end process, but what they do need to see is their desires and wants for the cake reflected in the outcoming design. So if they request a cake with, like, you know, white frosting and chocolate flavor and some sort of ganache on the inside, that's what we want to return to them. We don't want to return an entirely different cake, because if that kind of breaks the trust then. So you want to make sure that they communicate their needs, we demonstrate those needs in the system, and then that really shows that clear, logical guideline of how are we going to adopt SharePoint and how they are involved. The next component is the elephant, or the emotion. So this is going to be sharing real life success stories from previous departments. Maybe there was a pilot department that's already gone through SharePoint and they're already reaping the benefits of this change. And then we have addressing fears and building on an emotional connection to positive change. So often in organizations, especially if there was a failed change previously, there can be a lot of fears and a lot of kind of resistance to a new project or a new software implementation. So if we change people's kind of perception of the change and make it more positive, that'll have a huge impact on the success of the project, to see change as a positive thing and not as a negative. And then finally is the path. So this is going to be simplifying things as much as possible to make sure that our journey from the current state to the future state will be as seamless and as easy as possible. So this is clearly communicating how we are adopting SharePoint. It's not just telling the users we're adopting SharePoint and then kind of leaving them high and dry, but it's kind of clearly showing a step-by-step process saying, like, week 1, 2, 3, this is where we're going to be at in this process, and here's how we're going to finally adopt SharePoint in the end. Using out-of-the-box systems to automate simple workflows. There is so much we can do in SharePoint to set reminders or simple notifications that can add a lot of value to people's day-to-day work. And these little benefits culminate in a greater understanding that the new system is designed to simplify the daily workloads. So by connecting these two change management frameworks, we were able to achieve success by reducing resistance, increasing the user participation in the project, and paving the way for a successful digital transformation within the municipality. Okay. So what does records management success look like? So how does a successful implementation aid records management? Number one is a clear taxonomy of where content should and shouldn't live. This will simplify the classification, retrieval of files, and improve the overall governance and compliance of your organization. So number one, when rolling out an ECM solution, so an enterprise content management solution such as SharePoint, it's very important that users have a well-defined understanding of where their content should live and where it shouldn't live. If they do not know where to save a report or where to save an invoice, and they start to pool multiple documents and records in one area, that is going to make automated records management so much harder. So we want to make sure there's a clear taxonomy and users know where to save their content, and every kind of classification or piece of content has a home in their environment. The next one, this is a little bit more SharePoint specific, but this is a single content type per document library. This will reduce confusion or misclassification, allowing retention and compliance rules to be applied more consistently. So we always want to make sure that we have a single content type per document library. That'll be the content type that all files uploaded or created default to. If we had multiple content types or expected users to manually classify a content type, that is going to introduce a lot of risk. That's going to introduce confusion. Most users probably won't even go to change the content type because there may even be a lack of awareness that they need to do so, especially if some libraries have a singular content type and others have multiple. The next one is metadata tracking key retention triggers, such as end dates, superseded, and more. So when we have the users just manually inputting or being able to have a field to track things like end dates or status, this enables automated retention and disposal processes and minimizes the manual intervention of records managers and IT, therefore reducing errors and administrative overhead. So let's pretend we have a bunch of projects and we can't dispose of them until their expiry date has been reached. The only people who really best know the expiry date of their different projects is going to be the end users, and chances are they're tracking that information. But if they're not tracking the expiry dates or end dates as metadata in SharePoint, this can result in needing to email them, finding information maybe in an Excel tracking spreadsheet or a OneNote, or maybe it's just mentally in people's heads. We want to make sure that there's an area where they can put this metadata that can then support these event-based triggers for retention to reduce the administrative overhead when it's time for disposition. And then the final benefit is users avoid storing documents in OneDrive, desktop, or email attachments. So this consolidates records in a centralized system, improving version control and accessibility. So when SharePoint is successfully implemented, users will have a home to save their documents, they'll understand how to use SharePoint, and they'll feel confident working in that system. If there's a lack of confidence, if the implementation is poor, users will continue to just work out of their email attachments, desktops, or OneDrives, just because those may be habitual patterns for some team members. Conversely, how does a poor implementation hinder records management? So the first one, we kind of got into this on the last slide discussing like what's good versus bad, but just to run it home, if we have an unclear or inconsistent taxonomy, documents can end up scattered across various locations with no standardized structure. This will increase confusion and effort required to locate and classify records, therefore leading to a poor governance solution and compliance risks. The next one is multiple or random content types in a single library. Users may be uncertain about which content type to select, especially if they have like similar names and things like that, leading to inconsistent metadata and classification. Automation will also become significantly more difficult because each document may require different retention rules based on the content type being applied. Another risk of a poor implementation is a lack of metadata for retention triggers. So without those clear markers, event-based retention will be much harder to implement. And finally, users storing documents in personal or unapproved locations. This could result in critical files remaining outside our centralized system, leading to version control issues and even security risks. So, records management success, how do we get there? Well, by aligning technical solutions with change management's principles, this will lead to measurable improvements in the SharePoint adoption, which in turn streamlines the deployment of records management. So really, the components are a quality information architecture plus informed end users equals in a better functioning automated records management solution. Okay, so it's just the quality of our information architecture plus having those end users feeling empowered and informed, being carried through this change management process will result in a successful automated records management solution. We can't have one without the other. We need to have that strong design and that strong technical component plus the buy-in and the support of the end users. So how do we go about designing these user-centric strategies? There are two methodologies to approach this, but the first one is active listening. So this is prioritizing user feedback to tailor solutions to address real concerns. This is making sure that throughout this change management process, sometimes we can kind of get lost in the goal where, okay, we want automated records management, or we want to be in SharePoint. But as we're going through this transformation process from the current to future state, it's really important to listen to that user feedback, to listen to those concerns about like, hey, I have this process. Will this be simplified or made more complicated in SharePoint? And something I've noticed on project work is people tend to default to think that if they're moving into a new system, their existing processes will become more complicated, or something that they gained expertise in, they'll now have to kind of relearn everything. So it's really important that we prioritize listening to the end users and communicating and saying like, hey, actually this process could be simplified in SharePoint, or by guiding them through training, they'll feel empowered to be able to do these new processes in a new system and regain that expertise working out of SharePoint. The next one is empathy-driven communication. So this is developing messaging that validates the user experiences and highlights the benefits in relatable terms. So to most end users, communicating something like, oh, this is going to improve organizational governance, that can be a very abstract thing for them to grasp. So you have to think of it more relevant to what they do. So if they're like, a department that's constantly sharing out files or collaborating, you need to communicate the value in terms of what's valuable to them and what's tangible to them. And when they work successfully within SharePoint and they work with utilizing those best practices, it supports overall organizational success. So those are just two key aspects to help promote user-centric strategies, but active listening and involvement from the end users, making sure that as records managers or IT personnel, project sponsors, that we truly value and take that feedback and include it as part of our implementations, and then making sure we're being empathetic in our communications to address those emotional aspects and the resistance that users may feel. So the outcomes of having user-centric strategies is, of course, an inclusive and supportive transition process. It's really, really important that everyone involved in the change process feels that they're in a supportive environment. If they feel like they're being left behind by the records managers or IT or even their colleagues, that is going to cause issues down the line. So we do want to make sure that everyone feels that they're in a supportive environment, that they can share their fears or share their desires and goals as an outcome. We want to minimize any anxieties, foster trust, and we want to make sure that this design is responsive to the user's needs and overall enhance the overall user experience. So it really just runs back to the point that when we go through these really big projects of change management, we're doing this for the overall good. And if we're not, listening to the end users and we're not being empathetic about this change, it's hard for them to really understand why this change or why this project is a good thing, because it's those little things that we do along the way that helps reinforce that, yes, this is actually something to benefit you and support you. All right, and how do we go about communicating the value of records management? To do so, we want to showcase the broader impact on organizational performance. So successful records management empowers end users with day-to-day benefits while driving broader organizational success. And we may have touched on this a little bit before, but our approach to communicating the value of records management is number one, translating technical benefits into everyday language using clear examples and relatable scenarios. So there might be one way to communicate this to IT, one way to communicate this as a records manager, and another way to communicate this to someone of the various departments in your organization. You need to communicate it in a way that they understand that it's not only valuable to the organization, but also to their individual role, to their team members, and to the overall kind of success that they see in the organization and simplifying their day-to-day workload. The second approach is reinforcing how records management practices not only contribute to compliance, but also enhanced operational efficiency. So it's sometimes good to start with maybe like a pain point or, what's something you're currently experiencing that's not the best. And then you can communicate how that can be improved by adopting SharePoint. So let's just say, you're working with like clerks or a team of people that are constantly searching and pulling records, without proper metadata and classification, it's probably going to be a lot harder to find the document they're looking for. But with correct classification, a strong taxonomy, and metadata, chances are they could probably find an invoice from 2023 in like a few seconds versus maybe something that may have taken like 10 minutes or 20 minutes or maybe even an hour before, just because that structure was so messy. And now we're moving to a structure that's much more clearly defined, has the right metadata, and users can quickly sort, filter, search, find what they're looking for. This next slide just continues to drive home how do we connect different end user benefits to organizational benefits. So some of the end user benefits that the different team members will gain from successful records management is, of course, time savings and efficiency. So being able to quickly locate and retrieve documents. There's also going to be reduced frustrations. So the taxonomy is intuitive. It's easy for people to navigate when they're onboarding new team members. It's very easy for them to find where the content lives, and there's minimized confusion and errors in regards to the accuracy of files, datas, versions, and all that great stuff. The next benefit is improved collaboration. So centralized storage, sharing links, metadata tracking, and co-authoring greatly streamline the kind of collaborative teamwork that people go through. And so that is a huge benefit in of itself, is that being able to collaborate effectively will make the procurement of a document or gaining feedback much more simple than having to share documents back and forth in email attachments. And then the last benefit to communicate of records management, of course, is enhanced confidence. So a reliable and secure records management builds trust in the shared information and builds trust that users know where the single source of truth is. They know how to find things. They are confident that when they go into their SharePoint environment, that these documents are accurate, they are up to date. If it's a poor implementation and they're not quite sure what is the source of truth, what is the most up-to-date document, are things properly categorized, that's going to reduce confidence. So when users feel confident about their work and where documents live, that's an overall benefit to the success of records management. And then on the organizational side, of course, we're going to have stronger compliance and risk management. So automated retention schedules and consistent metadata ensure regulatory adherence. We can also reap cost savings and operational efficiency. So maybe reducing redundant storage costs, manual intervention, and cutting operational expenses. I'm sure everyone at least once maybe had the requirement to kind of search or find a file or support someone in looking for something, and maybe they could have done something else, but then they spent an hour of their day just trying to find something. The next one is informed decision making. So accurate and easily accessible data supports strategic data-driven decisions. So if we're doing projects and we see how many are outstanding, maybe we work with a consistent vendor, those insights that we can pull from metadata can help drive insights and decision making. And of course, elevated reputation. So efficient document management improves the service delivery and builds trust not only internally in your organization, but also externally. All right, so now what we're just going to identify is just a couple risks, and then how can we mitigate them using our change management frameworks. So risk number one is missing or inaccurate content type classification is compromising the searchability and compliance. Here's our solution. Utilizing Drive, we are going to empower end users with customizable metadata fields to give them autonomy. We'll offer targeted training to support mastery, and then highlight how accurate classification supports organizational success through purpose. Utilizing the switch framework, we're going to provide clear step-by-step metadata guidelines, which is that logical rider, share success stories on the benefits of classifying their content, which is the elephant in that more emotional component to say, other people have seen success doing this and so can you. And finally, simplifying entry forms with automated validations. So where possible, we don't expect someone to fill in 20 fields of metadata, maybe reducing the amount of fields that they need to manually input. And if possible, if their metadata maybe lives in a database or a repository, we can integrate with that repository and maybe auto-populate some of that metadata as well, or just anything we can do to kind of simplify the amount of metadata they would be required to input. Right. Risk number two, saving documents in non-approved locations leads to misclassification and compliance issues. So the solution is we need to involve end users in site design to promote ownership. So going from Drive, this relates to autonomy. And we also are going to train users on the best practices and also explain how centralized storage makes it easier for team collaboration and onboarding. So those three components kind of connect to the autonomy through design, mastery through training, and purpose and how they benefit their team. Then utilizing Switch, we're going to develop an intuitive navigation with clear instructions. So if in the finance department, I'm going to make sure that the finance department and its taxonomy is very clear. So if I'm looking for accounts payable, it's called accounts payable. If there's acronyms, we're going to try and give things their full name in the navigation, just to make it as easy as possible for various team members to understand where to find things. Next, we're also going to use emotional appeals by demonstrating improved efficiency, which is the elephant. And then finally, we would restrict access to irrelevant sites and communicate and train people on how to favorite or bookmark frequent sites so they can navigate to them as quickly as possible. Risk number 3 is users retain obsolete documents leading to clutter, inefficiency, and risks, aka end users purposely try to prevent disposition. So our solutions for this is using Drive, which is motivation. We're going to offer continuous training on lifecycle management and empower users to manage document retention effectively. So this is kind of a combination of mastery and purpose to say, hey, it's not related to you. It's just this document is, classified against the retention schedule, and we only need to keep it for so long. So it's nothing related to that. Maybe you spent a long time in this and you want to keep it for a long time, but we really want to communicate what lifecycle management looks like, and that, based on our retention schedule, there isn't a requirement to keep this for longer, kind of, mitigating that emotional aspect or attachment people can have. Utilizing Switch, we want to establish clear deletion policies with step-by-step instructions. This can include, users' involvement in disposition reviews, being able to have a say if something's extended or deleted from the system, using examples to illustrate the benefits of a clean system. So saying like, you know what, maybe you don't want to see stuff from 2015. If we no longer need to retain it and the classification in our retention schedule says it's eligible for disposition, we can proceed with disposing that content. And then finally, using the path forward, we can implement automated reminders or cleanup triggers to promote end users to keep their environment clean and tidy and be aware of when dispositions should be conducted on files that are eligible for it. And then finally, risk number 4 is event-based retention is not being triggered accurately because the metadata is missing or incorrect. So solutions using Drive is number 1, we are going to empower users with training on recording key events with metadata instead of Excel spreadsheets or mental notes. So saying you're probably already tracking these event triggers already, such as expiry dates or end dates, but instead of keeping them in these other areas, we're just going to put them as metadata. We're going to format the metadata to maybe be more visually appealing so users can gain mastery. So maybe if a certain date is past today, it's in the past, maybe we make it red to really drive home that this is expired. So that visual component can really increase the buy-in and how users feel about the system. And then finally, we're going to explain how metadata tracking reduces admin efforts, so purpose. And then connecting to Switch, we're going to ensure that any custom metadata is logical and known by the end user. So we're not going to give them metadata that nobody would know. We want to make sure that the metadata is very targeted, logical, makes sense. So if they're taking an extra second to fill it in, it's going to benefit them in the long run and also records management. We're going to simplify the process with automated prompts or system integrations that detect events and easing the user experience. So that can kind of play into the path. So this can look like communications or automated prompts to kind of help support what metadata users may need to fill in, especially in regards to event triggers. All right, so those are 4 different risks and how we can mitigate them with our frameworks. So actionable strategies for RM implementation. Number 1, seamless integration. We need to implement automated records management solutions that are successful and seamless thanks to end user participation and knowledge of these background processes. We're going to leverage motivation and structure. So use insights from Drive and Switch to address both the emotional and rational aspects of change. And finally, proactive problem solving, developing strategies that anticipate challenges with clear, actionable solution responses. So going back to our learning objectives for this session. So learning objective number 1 was to understand the role of change management in records management. The objective is to recognize how integrating change management models such as ADKAR, Drive, and Switch will enhance records management implementations. And the takeaway is you now understand the importance of clear communication, emotional engagement, and structured processes to overcome resistance and drive records management adoption. Learning objective number 2 is setting the foundation for seamless records management. So we want to learn actionable steps to design a robust information architecture, utilize metadata, and standardize content types for better records management. The key takeaway is that we know that we need to implement end user training, a clear taxonomy, consistent classification, and centralized storage to ensure compliance can be layered over content efficiently. And finally, our last objective was risk mitigation in relation to records management solutions. The objective here was to learn how to identify and address key risk factors in records management, such as event-based retention, attachments versus link sharing, and inconsistent metadata, by applying targeted solutions and change management principles. The key takeaway is we understand how to effectively mitigate these risks through actionable frameworks and solutions to ensure a secure, compliant, and efficient records management environment.